Welcome, friend, to another episode of Interesting History for Sleep. Tonight, we'll be stepping quietly into the cloistered world of medieval monasteries to uncover the quiet rhythms, spiritual depth, and hidden details of the lives of monks in the Middle Ages. For the next couple of hours, let this gentle journey take you far away from modern noise and into a world of stone walls, candlelit prayers, and whispered chants. We'll explore everything from the strict routines of daily life to the secret gardens, the mysterious illuminated manuscripts, and the roles monks played in shaping the medieval world. Before we begin, I invite you to get comfortable. Close your eyes if you'd like, and let your breathing slow. Maybe you're lying in bed, or resting on a couch, or sitting peacefully by a window. Wherever you are, just relax. Let the calm and wonder of history ease you into rest. And, if you don't mind, leave a comment below, sharing where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always amazing to see how many people from around the world are joining in to listen to these stories. Now, let's begin our journey into the sacred silence of the monastic world. In the hushed silence of the cloister, time was not measured by clocks, but by devotion. The life of a medieval monk was governed by the rule, most famously, the rule of Saint Benedict's set of guidelines, written in the 6th century, that laid out not just how monks should pray, but how they should eat, sleep, speak, and think. For monks, time was sacred, and each passing hour offered a new opportunity to draw closer to God. The monastic day was divided into segments, marked by canonical hours, specific times, set aside for communal prayer and worship. These hours began well before dawn and stretched into the night, creating a rhythm that shaped every aspect of a monk's existence. Let's follow the daily path of a monk, from the first dark stirring to the closing silence. The day began in darkness. Long before the sun crested the horizon, monks were awakened by the sound of a bell echoing through the stone halls. This was the call to matins, the first of the daily offices. Monks would rise from their simple straw mattresses in shared dormitories, dress in their robes, and silently file into the cold stone church. Matins was the longest of the offices, and often included the chanting of psalms, readings from scripture, and reflections on the lives of saints. The dim light from flickering candles cast long shadows on the walls as voices rose in unison, chanting in Latin, in the silence of the pre-dawn hours. This act of shared devotion was as much about discipline as it was about faith. To wake, pray, and begin the day in darkness was to symbolically rise from death into life and echo of resurrection. As the sky began to pale and the first signs of morning light crept through narrow windows, monks gathered again for Lauds, the second office. Lauds was a celebration of light, both literal and spiritual. It marked the arrival of the new day and was filled with hymns of praise. After Lauds, monks would head to the chapter house for the daily chapter meeting. There, a chapter from the rule would be read aloud, offering guidance and reflection. Monks might confess small faults, receive instructions, or hear announcements about the day's work. Silence, obedience, and humility were at the heart of monastic conduct. Following Lauds and the chapter meeting came Prime, a short office that transitioned the monks into their daily labor. The work varied depending on the monastery's needs and location. Some monks tended to vegetable gardens, vineyards, or livestock. Others worked in the scriptorium, copying manuscripts with patient precision. Still others were cooks, infirmarians, or scholars. Manual labor was not only encouraged but required. Ora et labora, pray and work, was the monastic motto. Labor was a form of worship, a humbling reminder that even the smallest act, digging, cleaning, cooking, was sacred when done in the name of God. Around mid-morning, monks would pause for terce, the third canonical hour. It was a brief service, but an important reminder to reconnect with the divine even in the midst of daily toil. Terce often included short readings, chants, and prayers for guidance. After terce, monks would return to their tasks. The day continued in quiet rhythm, punctuated by prayer, structured by labor, softened by silence. Speaking was discouraged during most hours of the day, and monks used hand gestures to communicate when necessary. This silence was not simply a rule, but a disciplined one that made space for inner reflection. Sext, and the midday meal around noon came sext, another office followed by the main meal of the day. Meals were eaten in the refectory, a long hall where monks sat at communal tables. Food was simple loafen bread, cheese, legumes, and seasonal vegetables. Meat was typically avoided unless prescribed for illness. During meals, silence was maintained. A designated reader would stand at a lectern and read aloud from scripture or the lives of the saints. Eating and listening became a single, unified act of worship and nourishment. After lunch and a short period of rest, monks gathered again for none the ninth hour around mid-afternoon. This brief service helped center the community as the heat of the day passed and fatigue set in. Following none, monks returned to their tasks or took time for study and reading. Monasteries often housed libraries, and literacy among monks was not only common but encouraged. The pursuit of knowledge was a form of devotion. Reading was a gateway to understanding divine truth. As the sun began to sink, Vespers was held. This evening prayer was rich with symbolism and gratitude. It marked the close of the day's labors and prepared the soul for rest. Psalms of thanksgiving were chanted as the golden light filtered into the church. After Vespers, a light supper was served, usually soup or porridge, and monks might walk quietly through the cloister garden, meditate, or continue reading. The mood was one of winding down, reflecting on the day, and seeking peace. Compline. The final office was Compline, held just before bedtime. Compline was the most intimate and personal of the prayers. It included an examination of conscience, prayers for protection through the night, and a hymn known as the Salve Regina. Once Compline was over, the great silence began, a period of total quiet that lasted until after lauds the next morning. No talking, no noise, no interruptions. This silence was both literal and spiritual, a way of surrendering to the mystery of the night and trusting in divine care. Monks would return to their dormitories, light a single candle if necessary, and rest. Their day had been measured not by minutes or tasks, but by devotion and unity. In the medieval cloister, time itself became sacred. Every action had its hour, and every hour had its meaning. This structure provided stability in a chaotic world, especially during centuries marked by war, famine, and political upheaval. Even today, the rhythm of monastic time continues in abbeys around the world. Though modernity has shifted the pace of life dramatically, there remains something deeply comforting in this slow, intentional structural world, where each hour offers a new chance to connect with something beyond the self. In our next section, we'll step outside the daily routine to explore the architecture that made this life possible. The cloisters, chapels, cells, and corridors that sheltered generations of monks in peace. Take a moment now to breathe deeply, and when you're ready, we'll continue our quiet journey. A medieval monastery was not merely a collection of stone buildings. It was a world within walls, designed with a spiritual purpose in mind. Every arch, cloister, and corridor was crafted to reflect the soul's journey towards stillness, balance, and divine presence. To walk through a monastery was to pass through spaces that invited quiet contemplation, discipline, and structured living. The architecture was a physical manifestation of monastic ideals: silence, order, humility, and devotion. In this section, we will step through the monastery as if we were there, breathing in the scent of cold stone and candle wax, listening to the echoes of bare feet on flagstone, and observing the thoughtful balance between solitude and community. Monasteries were usually built away from bustling towns, tucked into valleys, forests, or remote coastal regions. This separation was deliberate, for monks sought to detach from worldly distractions. High walls encircled the monastery, not to trap its residents, but to preserve the sanctity of their spiritual pursuits. Entering the main gate often meant stepping into a large courtyard known as the outer court, where guests and lay visitors were received away from the cloistered interior. Moving inward, the heart of monastic life was the cloister-covered walkway surrounding an open courtyard. It was a sacred circuit for quiet walking, meditation, and reflection. The cloister garden in the center was often simple, featuring herbs, a well, or a single tree. Symbolically, it represented the Garden of Eden, a place of purity and return. The rhythm of life pulsed along the cloisters, with monks gliding silently in robes, whispering prayers, or contemplating sacred texts. Adjacent to the cloisters were some of the most important rooms in monastic life. The chapter house was where the community gathered each morning to hear a chapter from the Rule of Saint Benedict, the guiding text for daily monastic conduct. Seated in a semicircle on stone benches, the monks would listen, confess faults, and receive guidance. It was a space of accountability, humility, and unity, often beautifully vaulted and acoustically refined to allow even a whisper to carry. From there, one might walk into the dormitory or dormitorium. These were typically long, narrow halls filled with rows of simple wooden beds. In the early days of monasticism, monks slept communally, though silently, with strict routines. Rising together for night prayers and retiring at a set time ensured no hour of the day escaped the embrace of devotion. The refectory, or dining hall, was a solemn yet communal place. Meals were eaten in silence, while one monk read aloud from a holy text. This act turned mealtime into a spiritual exercise, nourishing both body and soul. The architecture here was practical: long stone tables, high ceilings, and large windows to let in the light, but it also reflected a deeper truth. Even in eating, one was never separate from the divine. Meals were modest, often vegetarian, and taken at specific times. Eating was not for indulgence, but for sustenance and discipline. Then came the scriptorium, a place of immense cultural and spiritual importance. Here, in a room flooded with light and hushed reverence, monks copied manuscripts by hand. The scriptorium was the womb of knowledge in medieval Europe, preserving not only sacred scripture, but classical texts, medical knowledge, and history. It was an act of devotion to write, to reproduce God's word. and the wisdom of ages in careful script, illuminated with gold, adorned with detailed illustrations, and bound in leather. The library, often connected to the scriptorium, housed these precious volumes. For many monks, these books were a spiritual treasure more valuable than gold. While silence ruled the space, the library buzzed internally with intellectual curiosity and divine mystery. These libraries, though small by today's standards, were meticulously organized and fiercely protected. Of course, no monastery was complete without its church or abbey. Architecturally grand, yet spiritually humbling, the church was the central axis of monastic life. Bells marked the hours for the divine office, and monks gathered here 7 to 8 times a day. The layout was cruciform-shaped like a cross, with altars, choir stalls, and stained glass windows that told stories without words. Chanting filled the nave, creating a soundscape of sacredness. Every stone, every shadow, and every echo seemed to direct the mind heavenward. In addition to spiritual spaces, monasteries included practical areas, the kitchens, cellars, workshops, and infirmaries. Work was sacredora et labora, prayer and labor. Monks were not idle contemplatives, but active stewards of their environment. They made wine, brewed ale, tended gardens, and cared for the sick. The layout of the monastery ensured that even these daily chores were done in an atmosphere of order and peace. These were often built over running water, showcasing the surprisingly advanced sanitation practices of the time. Cleanliness was part of godliness, and hygiene was no exception. What's remarkable is how these buildings were arranged with intention. The placement of each room served both functional and spiritual needs. The quietest spaces were furthest from the noisy work areas. There was also an emotional architecture to these spaces. You could feel it in the way sound moved whispers amplified in the chapter house, chants reverberating in the nave, silence lingering in the cloister. You could feel it in how space was shared, monks dining side by side without speaking, praying together, yet inwardly alone. The architecture cultivated a spiritual psychology. You were never truly alone, and yet solitude was always within reach. Seasonal rhythms were also built into the structure. Gardens for spring and summer, enclosed halls for winter warmth, and a refectory that caught the low sun in colder months. Monasteries were tuned not only to time, but to nature itself. Importantly, the monastery was a place of protection. In violent medieval Europe, walls were both symbolic and literal shields. But within them, the architecture was not about hiding it, was about revealing the divine in all things. Every stone had a purpose. Every hall had a rhythm. The very structure was a kind of prayer. In this way, the architecture of a medieval monastery was a silent teacher. Without speaking a word, it guided monks through a life of order, simplicity, and devotion. It held within its stone bones the weight of centuries and the whispers of 1,000 prayers. For the monk, walking slowly through the cloister, head bowed, fingers grazing the cool stone, this was more than shelter. It was sacred space. It was silence given form. In the quiet corners of medieval monasteries, a different kind of labor took place, one not of soil or stone, but of ink and parchment. Here, in the scriptorium, monks became scribes, and the act of writing became a sacred ritual. These dimly lit rooms, often positioned to receive the best natural light during the day, were sanctuaries of silence and concentration. The scriptorium was not just a workplace, it was a sacred space where time itself seemed to slow down allowing each letter and line to carry the weight of devotion. The process began with the preparation of the materials. Vellum, or parchment specially treated animal skins, were smoothed and cut into sheets. These pages had to be flawless. Even the tiniest imperfection could disrupt the sacred task of transcription. Monks would spend hours preparing these surfaces, scraping away any blemishes, soaking the skins, drying them, and trimming them to size. The preparation of ink was equally meticulous. Made from oak galls, iron salts, and gum, the ink had to be dark, durable. The writing instruments were carefully maintained quill pens, usually made from goose or swan feathers. These were cut and shaped to create sharp points, allowing the monks to form precise and consistent lettering. In a world without printing presses, every letter was hand-drawn, and the beauty of the script mattered. The most common script used was Carolingian, minuscule, simple, clear, and elegant. Its legibility made it ideal for sacred texts. Before the first word was written, the page had to be ruled with faint lines to guide the writing. This ensured the text remained straight and evenly spaced. Sometimes, faint dots were added to mark the start of lines or to help center headings. These guidelines were subtle, but they were essential to maintaining the harmony and structure of the manuscript. Once the writing began, it was a test of patience and devotion. Monks would often recite prayers before starting, asking for divine guidance and steady hands. Each word was written slowly, carefully, and with full awareness of its spiritual significance. Errors were rare, but when they occurred, had to be delicately corrected. In some cases, the monk would scrape away the ink with a sharp knife and rewrite the line. In others, a marginal note or symbol would indicate the correction beyond the text. Many manuscripts featured elaborate decorations, illuminations that transformed the page into a canvas of light and color. These illuminations included ornate initials, borders filled with vines and mythical creatures, and miniature scenes from the Bible or daily life. Gold leaf was often applied, giving the pages a radiant glow when they caught the light. The application of gold was a delicate process involving adhesive and careful burnishing. It was both a technical skill and a symbolic gesture, bringing divine light into the written word. Illuminators often worked in collaboration with scribes, sometimes even within the same space. While one monk penned the sacred lines, another would plan the illustrations and color palette. These collaborations resulted in books that were not just repositories of knowledge, but masterpieces of art. The Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels are famous examples, blending Celtic design with Christian imagery in breathtaking detail. The content of these manuscripts was diverse. The Bible, of course, was central, but monks also copied the writings of the Church Fathers, theological commentaries, saints' lives, and sermons. Beyond religious texts, classical works of Greek and Roman literature, science, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy were preserved. In doing so, monasteries became the custodians of civilization's memory during times when much of Europe was in turmoil. The act of copying texts was not merely educationally, was spiritual. Monks believed that through writing, they were participating in the divine act of creation. Each manuscript was a labor of love and reverence, a testament to the belief that words carried the presence of the sacred. This devotion was echoed in marginal notes, where monks would sometimes add brief reflections, complaints about the cold, or even light-hearted drawings. These glimpses into their personalities remind us that behind every manuscript was a human hand, guided by faith. Scriptoria varied in size and sophistication. Some were large communal rooms where many monks worked in silence, while others were small cells for individual scribes. In either case, the atmosphere was one of solemn focus. Silence was maintained to avoid distraction, and the layout of the room often included high windows to provide natural light without direct sun that might damage the delicate materials. The significance of the scriptorium extended beyond the monastery walls. Books produced here were often sent to other monasteries, universities, or patrons. They were exchanged as gifts, used in teaching, or added to growing libraries. As literacy spread, so did the influence of monastic writing. These texts shaped theological debates, preserved ancient wisdom, and laid the groundwork for the intellectual revival of the later Middle Ages. Over time, the rise of universities in cities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford created a new demand for books. This led to the development of secular scriptoria and the emergence of professional scribes outside the monastic context. Still, the monastic tradition remained a vital force, particularly in regions where other forms of education were scarce. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century would eventually render the scriptorium obsolete. But for nearly 1,000 years, monks had kept the light of learning alive through their tireless dedication to the written word. Their legacy endures, not only in the manuscripts themselves, but in the idea that knowledge is sacred and preserving it is a form of worship. To imagine a monk hunched over a desk in the soft glow of morning light, dipping his quill into ink and slowly drawing the first letter of a psalm is to glimpse a moment of quiet transcendence, a workshop of the spirit, and a bridge between the ancient and the eternal. And as the final period was placed, the final page dried, and the book bound. What remained was more than a text, it was a prayer captured in ink, meant to last for generations. In the daily rhythm of monastic life, food was far more than sustenance. It was a ritual, a discipline, and a profound expression of faith. In many medieval monasteries, what was consumed and, more importantly, what was not reflected the central values of humility, simplicity, and self-denial that shaped the cloistered existence. Meals were a communal event, a sacred pause in the daily cycle of prayer, labor, and contemplation, and even the act of eating was infused with spiritual significance. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided much of Western monastic practice, laid out detailed instructions about the food monks could eat and how often. According to the rule, monks were typically given 2 meals a day, one around midday and another in the early evening. These were to be modest, designed to sustain the body without indulging the senses. The emphasis was on plain food, served in moderation. Flesh meat from 4-legged animals was generally forbidden for monks, especially in the main cloister, though exceptions might be made for the sick in the infirmary. The staples of the monastic diet were grains, legumes, vegetables, and bread. Porridge, made from oats or barley, was a common dish, often flavored with herbs from the monastery garden. Lentils, peas, and beans offered much-needed protein. Vegetables like leeks, onions, cabbage, and carrots were grown in monastery gardens and formed the backbone of daily meals. Cheese and eggs were sometimes included, and fish played an important role, especially on feast days or during fasting periods when meat was prohibited. Fasting held a significant place in monastic life. The monastic calendar was marked by long stretches of fasting, seasons especially during Lent and Advent, where meals would be further reduced in both quantity and richness. On fast days, the first meal might be delayed until late afternoon, and monks would eat only one modest portion. These fasts were not only about abstaining from food, but also served as a spiritual discipline, intended to humble the body and sharpen the soul's focus on divine matters. Yet monastic fasting was not entirely austere or joyless. The church calendar was punctuated with feast days, celebrating saints, holy events, or key dates in the life of Christ. On these days, the atmosphere in the monastery could shift. Meals were more generous, sometimes including rare treats like spiced cakes, dried fruits, or extra servings of fish. These feasts were celebrated not with extravagance, but with joy and reverence. Food, after all, could be a form of praise, a way of honoring divine abundance while maintaining gratitude and restraint. Monks dined in silence, usually in a room known as the refectory. Long wooden tables stretched the length of the hall, where monks sat on benches, eating in silence, while one of their brothers stood at a lectern reading from the scriptures or the writings of the church fathers. This reader at meals' roll was an honored one, reminding everyone present that even as the body was nourished, the soul must also be fed. Talking during meals was discouraged, and if a monk needed something, he would often signal with hand gestures rather than speaking. Despite the silence, the refectory was a place of quiet companionship. Sharing a meal reinforced the communal bonds that held the monastery together. The setting itself was usually simple but dignified. The floor might be of stone, the walls plain, but there would be a certain harmony to the arrangement. Often a crucifix or a religious mural adorned the walls, keeping the monks mindful of their higher calling, even in this mundane activity. On major feast days, the abbot might join the monks at the table, and there could be special readings chosen to reflect the significance of the day. Wine, typically watered down, was allowed in moderation according to the rule of Saint Benedict, though in some stricter communities it was discouraged altogether. Some monasteries brewed their own ale or cultivated vineyards for sacramental purposes. The moderation encouraged in drinking was another layer of discipline and another opportunity to practice restraint. The preparation of meals was itself an act of devotion. Monks rotated through duties in the kitchen, working in teams to prepare, serve, and clean up. This work was seen not as menial labor, but as service to the community and to God. Great care was taken to ensure that food was prepared with cleanliness and reverence. The kitchen gardens, tended by monks known as hortolani, provided fresh herbs and vegetables, while the cellarius managed the stores of grain, oil, wine, and preserved goods. Every detail, from planting seeds to stirring soup, was a thread in the greater tapestry of spiritual discipline. Some of the most fascinating records from medieval monasteries come in the form of kitchen inventories, garden manuals, and dietary prescriptions. These show not only what was eaten, but how deeply monks thought about food as part of their religious life. Monks in different regions adapted their diets to the local environment. In coastal areas, sea fish and seaweed might appear on the table. In inland Europe, freshwater fish like carp, trout, and perch were more common. Some monasteries had elaborate fish ponds to ensure a steady supply. While simplicity was the norm, monks were also known for their innovation in food preservation and storage. Salting, smoking, drying, and fermenting were all techniques used to keep food available through the leaner months. Bread ovens were common features in monastic kitchens, and baking was a daily task. The scent of baking bread became one of the most enduring sensory memories of monastic life. It's also important to consider that the ideal monastic diet often contrasted with reality. Not all monasteries observed the rule to the letter. Some wealthy foundations became known for their luxurious meals and lenient fasting practices, drawing criticism from reformers within and outside the church. But even these deviations reveal something crucial. Food was always a reflection of the monastery's values, whether in discipline or in indulgence. Feast days brought color to the calendar. Saints' days, Easter, Christmas, and other major celebrations called for processions, special masses, and enhanced meals. Fish dishes were often elaborate, incorporating spices, herbs, and artistic presentation. The monks might enjoy extra courses or special desserts, such as honeyed pastries or almond-based sweets. But these meals, while more abundant, were not simply about pleasure. They were liturgical extensions of the joy celebrated in the chapel. The discipline around food also extended to hospitality. Monasteries were centers of refuge and welcome, offering meals and shelter to travelers, pilgrims, and the poor. The almoner was responsible for distributing food to the needy at the monastery gates, and special kitchens were often built for guests and the poor, separate from the monks' refectory. In feeding others, monks saw the face of Christ, and giving food was an act of mercy as vital as prayer. Ultimately, every bite in the monastery was a kind of prayer. The choices made around food, what to eat, when to eat, how to prepare and serve, it were reflections of an entire worldview rooted in devotion, humility, and order. Eating was never just about survival. It was an expression of balance between the body and the soul, between celebration and restraint. Through food, monks not only sustained themselves, but nourished a community and a tradition that has echoed through the centuries. Even today, the culinary traditions of medieval monasteries continue to influence cuisine, especially in regions where monasteries remain active. From artisanal breads to simple vegetable stews, echoes of the monastic diet remain. And in their emphasis on mindful eating, community meals, and seasonal fare, medieval monks may have anticipated modern values of wellness and sustainability. In their quiet kitchens and echoing refectories, they cooked not just for hunger, but for holiness. When a man stepped into the monastery, he was not merely changing the pace of his life, he was surrendering it entirely. With shaved head and robe, he left behind his family name, his personal ambitions, and often even his worldly identity. What awaited him beyond the cloister gate was a life shaped by 3 solemn vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. These weren't temporary commitments or symbolic declarations. They were lifelong contracts made before God, witnessed by his brothers in the faith, and carried out every hour of every day for the rest of his life. These vows weren't invented on a whim. They were the result of centuries of spiritual development, rooted in the teachings of early Christian ascetics and formalized by figures like Saint Benedict. The monastic vow was seen as a sacred echo of Christ's own life, his simplicity, his celibacy, and his submission to the will of the Father. For the monk, taking these vows was an attempt to imitate Christ as closely as possible, not only in belief, but in body, mind, and action. The first vow, poverty, was perhaps the most visible. It required the monk to renounce all personal ownership. He could not own land, he could not own money, he could not own even the robe on his back or the spoon he ate with. Everything he used was provided by the community and returned to the community when he no longer needed it. This wasn't about suffering or misery, it was about freedom. By giving up the right to possess, the monk aimed to escape the endless pull of greed, status, and comparison. This vow was taken seriously. If a monk arrived with family wealth, it had to be given away before he entered. If he was found hiding coins or secretly accepting gifts, it was seen as a breach of trust, not only with his brothers, but with God. In many monasteries, the punishment for such a breach could be severe: public confession, loss of privileges, and in rare cases, even expulsion. But poverty wasn't just about things, it was about attitude. A monk was trained to find contentment in simplicity. He wore the same type of robe each day, ate whatever food was given, and slept in a modest cell, often with little more than a blanket and a wooden bed. There was no personal decoration, no mirrors, no jewelry. Life was stripped down to the essentials so that the monk could focus entirely on the eternal. Then came the vow of chastity. This was not simply abstaining from marriage or sex, it was a total redirection of one's desires. The monk was not supposed to suppress love, but to transform it. Where once he might have given his affection to a partner or family, now he gave it wholly to God. His love became prayer, his desire became devotion, his body became a vessel, not for personal pleasure, but for sacred service. This vow was the most private and often the most difficult. Human longing does not vanish with a vow. Thoughts wander, feelings stir, loneliness visits, especially in the quiet hours of the night. To help manage this, monks engaged in frequent prayer, fasting, and manual labor. Their schedules were strict, their minds constantly redirected to the divine. Even the design of the monastery helped. It was enclosed, far from the distractions of town life. Contact with outsiders, especially women, was rare and carefully regulated. Yet temptation still found its way in. There are records of monks confessing struggles, of secret liaisons discovered, of monasteries dealing quietly with scandal. The vow was lofty, and not all lived up to it. But the monastic tradition did not expect perfection, it expected honesty, discipline, and a willingness to begin again. When a monk failed, he was called not to shame, but to repentance. The third vow, obedience, was the most encompassing of all. It asked the monk to give up his will not just once, but over and over again. He submitted himself to the authority of the abbot, who was seen as the spiritual father of the community. If the abbot gave an order, it was to be followed without hesitation. If the community made a decision, the individual was expected to support it, even if he disagreed. This surrender of personal will wasn't seen as a weakness. It was viewed as a path to humility. In obeying another, the monk was thought to be echoing Christ's own obedience, 7 unto death. Every chore done without complaint, every schedule followed without resistance, every task performed with care was a silent prayer of obedience. Monks were trained to respond to commands with immediacy. The rule of Saint Benedict even encourages monks to leave their work unfinished if summoned by a superior. This kind of obedience created a rhythm of discipline. There was no place for self-will or argument. Pride had to be laid aside. In this atmosphere, a deeper form of peace could arise, one not based on personal achievement, but on shared harmony. Still, obedience came with challenges. Abbots were not always kind or wise. Some abused their power, enforced harsh rules, or played favorites. In such cases, monks had few options for appeal. Yet, even in these hardships, obedience was upheld as a form of spiritual endurance, way to cultivate inner strength and surrender ego. Together, these three vows created a life that was radically countercultural. In a world driven by wealth, desire, and self-expression, the monk chose the opposite. He embraced poverty instead of riches, chastity instead of indulgence, and obedience instead of independence. To the outside world, this life seemed extreme, unnatural, but to the monk, it was a form of liberation. He had found peace not by taking more, but by letting go. The daily schedule of the monastery reinforced these vows. The monk's time was not his own. He awoke not when he felt rested, but when the bell rang for matins. He didn't choose his meals, his clothes, or even his reading material. Each moment was assigned, each action prescribed. Far from feeling restricted, many monks found this predictability comforting. It freed them from decision fatigue, allowing them to focus on prayer, study, and inner growth. But monks were still human. They grew tired, they grew restless. Some regretted their vows. A few left the monastery entirely, asking to be released. Others stayed, but struggled silently. For this reason, monastic communities placed strong emphasis on confession, spiritual guidance, and mutual support. A faltering monk was not cast out, but gently corrected. A struggling brother was reminded of his purpose, prayed for, and sometimes given lighter duties until he regained strength. When a monk took his final vows, after a long period of testing and preparation, he would lie face down before the altar, a symbol of total surrender. Then, rising, he would speak aloud the promises that would define his life. From that moment on, he was no longer his own. He belonged to God, to his brothers, and to a way of life centuries old. Over time, these vows shaped not just individual monks, but entire cultures. Monasteries became centers of learning, charity, and agriculture. Their commitment to simplicity, celibacy, and submission allowed them to focus on long-term goals, preserving texts, cultivating land, healing the sick, and praying for the world. Even today, in corners of the world, these vows are still lived. In silent cloisters and modern religious communities, men and women continue to renounce wealth, refrain from relationships, and surrender their will not out of despair, but out of love. They offer a quiet reminder that another way of life is possible, one not built on acquisition or ambition, but on stillness, sacrifice, and service. And so, the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience continue to whisper through stone corridors and candlelit chapels, not as relics of the past, but as living commitments, made each day by those who believe that in giving all, one gains everything. Though they lived behind high stone walls and followed strict routines of prayer, silence, and separation, medieval monks were never entirely cut off from the world beyond the monastery gate. In fact, the quiet life of the cloister had a surprisingly deep influence on the outside world economically, culturally, and spiritually. Monasteries were not simply places of solitude. They were also hubs of activity, tucked into forests, nestled in valleys, or perched on hillsides. They dotted the landscape of medieval Europe like quiet fortresses of faith. And yet, each was a kind of heartbeat in its regent, keeping time, giving care, and shaping society in subtle but powerful ways. At the center of a monastery's interaction with the outside world was land. Most monasteries were granted large plots of land by kings, nobles, or the church itself. These lands were not ornamental, they were worked with tireless precision. Monks became farmers, cultivating fields of wheat, barley, and rye. They raised sheep and cattle, tended orchards, and built watermills and fish ponds. Everything produced was for the community, but much of it also fed nearby towns and travelers. In many cases, the monastery's surplus was sold or traded, and its agricultural innovations spread to the surrounding countryside. Far from being idle or sheltered, monks were often the most knowledgeable land managers of their time. They developed crop rotation systems, pioneered irrigation techniques, and improved the quality of soil and seed. In places where famine was a constant threat, monasteries became islands of stability. People came not just for food, but for advice on how to grow their own. Then there were the breweries. Monks are famously linked to the production of beer and wine, and not without reason. Brewing was both a necessity and a craft. Water was often unsafe to drink, but beer, especially the low-alcohol kinds brewed by monks, was a clean and nourishing alternative. Monks experimented with hops, refined fermentation processes, and passed down detailed recipes over generations. Some of the world's oldest brewing traditions began behind monastery walls. Even today, certain European abbey ales trace their roots directly to monastic origins. But brewing was just one of many crafts practiced within the cloister. Monasteries were also known for their skill in baking, candle making, cheese making, and medicine. Monks cultivated herbs in carefully kept gardens, learning which plants could ease pain, heal wounds, or calm the nerves. They copied ancient medical texts and, through trial and care, added their own observations. Infirmaries attached to monasteries served not just monks, but outsiders, peasants, travelers, and sometimes even nobles. And indeed, travelers were a frequent sight at the gates. Though cloistered, monasteries were known as places of hospitality. Pilgrims on religious journeys, merchants crossing dangerous roads, and the poor, with nowhere else to turn, often found shelter, food, and kindness within monastery guest houses. Hospitality was not a luxury, it was a sacred duty. In receiving the stranger, the monk was taught to see Christ himself. This tension between enclosure and openness defined much of monastic life. The cloister was meant to protect the monk from worldly temptation, but not to breed indifference. The vow of stability, central to Benedictine life, meant staying rooted in a single place, committing to a local community. Even if from within the walls, that commitment was quiet but real. It shaped the rhythm of towns, the pattern of roads, and the habits of villagers who looked to the monastery, not only for goods, but for guidance. In many regions, the monastery became the de facto center of life. Bells from the tower marked the hours for miles around. Festivals and feast days revolved around the monastic calendar. Monks taught children to read, copied manuscripts for bishops, and sometimes even settled disputes among nobles. Their silence held a kind of power. Their prayers, spoken on behalf of the world, were thought to protect it. Not all interaction was peaceful, however. The wealth and influence of monasteries occasionally sparked resentment. Some lords envied their lands. Some townspeople questioned their tax exemptions. In times of political turmoil, monasteries could become targets, raided by armies, taxed heavily, or drawn into debates far removed from prayer and contemplation. Still, the vast majority of monastic influence was quiet and constructive. Take the library, for instance. Inside, monks preserved ancient knowledge, Roman histories, Greek philosophy, early Christian theology. In an age before printing presses, every book was hand-copied. The scriptorium, a long, narrow room filled with desks and soft light, echoed with the scratch of quills and the turning of pages. These books did not stay hidden. They were loaned, shared, studied, and sometimes even given away. A visiting scholar might spend weeks in a monastery library. A noble might request a copy of a rare text. A local priest might come for training or guidance. In this way, monasteries became slow-burning centers of learning. Long before the rise of universities, it was within the walls of monasteries that Europe remembered how to read. The arts, too, found a home here. Monks composed music chanting in harmonies that still echo today in cathedrals and concert halls. They painted delicate illuminations in gold and blue, decorating sacred texts with symbols of beauty and wonder. They built chapels with high arches and stone vaults that soared toward heaven. These works weren't just for their own joy, they were offerings, a gift to God and a gift to anyone who entered. In the harsh medieval world, where plague and war were common, monasteries offered a different rhythm, a slower, gentler way of life. For the sick, the poor, the traveler, the curious, the monastery stood as a beacon of refuge, a place where life was shaped by prayer, not power, by humility, not ambition. Even those who never stepped inside felt its presence. Children grew up hearing the bells. Farmers watched monks till their fields and followed their example. Dying men sent for monks to pray at their side. In this way, the monastery became both separate from the world and deeply woven into it. It is important to note that not all monasteries were the same. Some were stricter, almost entirely cut off from outside contact. Others were more engaged, teaching in schools, writing chronicles, or advising kings. But all shared the same core belief that a life of contemplation could benefit more than the individual. It could ripple outward, quietly changing the world without needing to rule it. In many ways, monks were the hidden hands of medieval society. Their influence was not loud, but lasting. Their way of life created sanctuaries of peace in violent times. Their gardens fed more than mouths. Their prayers reached beyond walls. Even now, centuries later, the legacy remains. Roads still bear names that recall ancient abbeys. Farms still follow techniques refined by monks. Libraries still hold books once copied by candlelight. And in quiet corners of the world, you can still find cloisters still, peaceful, and humming softly with the rhythm of devotion. The outside world was never truly outside. It was, in a sense, part of the monastery's mission, to serve without being seen, to give without expecting, to anchor society not with power or wealth, but with quiet, unwavering purpose. And so the monks continued, year after year, generation after generation, praying behind stone walls, yet living for a world beyond them. Inside the cloistered walls of the monastery, where candles flickered in quiet halls, and the only sound was the rustle of robes or the low chant of prayer, a different kind of battle raged. It was not a war with swords or armor. It was quieters, lower but no less consuming. These were the private trials of the soul, the temptations of the flesh, the doubts of the mind, the relentless whispers of human longing in a place built for divine silence. To outsiders, monastic life may have seemed peaceful, even easy, a retreat from the chaos of the world. But those who lived it knew the truth. A monk's greatest struggle often came from within. Each day began before the sun. Cold floors, aching joints, weary eyes yet. Still they rose, still they prayed. The body was not pampered, it was trained, molded like clay through repetition, denial, and discipline. Hunger was a companion, sleep was broken, comfort was rare. This hardship was not punishment, but preparation, a forging of spirit through the slow erosion of selfishness. But the mind of the mind was harder to train. Alone in their cells, surrounded by silence, monks often found their thoughts drifting. Memories of the world they had left behind would surface. The warmth of a lover's embrace, the laughter of a child, the taste of wine, the thrill of ambition. Some days, these thoughts slipped by like passing clouds. Other times, they settled heavy and unmoving. These temptations were known by name. The Desert Fathers, early Christian hermits, had once catalogued them: gluttony, lust, pride, sloth, envy, greed, wrath. Later, they became known as the 7 deadly sins. Monks were taught to recognize them, not just as acts, but as inward stirrings, a moment of jealousy, a flicker of desire, a rising of anger. All were signs of danger. When such struggles became too great, monks would often confess to a spiritual elder, not always in words, sometimes in simple symbols or gestures. The goal was not punishment, but healing. Yet for more serious lapses, the monastery had rules and the consequences could be harsh. Discipline was central to monastic life. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by countless monks across Europe, laid it out in clear, measured language. Those who disobeyed were corrected gently, at first through private words, extra prayers, or time alone in reflection. But persistent disobedience led to public rebuke, removal from communal meals, isolation during services, or, in the gravest cases, temporary expulsion from the community. There are records of monks made to lie prostrate on the chapel floor, while the others stepped over them in silence. Some were forced to stand in the cold, barefoot, reciting psalms of repentance. Others were sent to live alone for weeks or months, cut off from the comfort of brotherhood. Yet these punishments were not intended to shame. In the eyes of the monastery, they were acts of mercy, opportunities for the soul to realign itself, to return to the path of humility and discipline. Many monks came back from such trials with deeper faith and steadier hearts. Others never did. There are stories quiet, buried in ancient manuscripts, of monks who fled in the night. Overcome by temptation or despair, they ran from the walls that once promised peace. Some vanished into the world and were never seen again. Others returned years later, broken and seeking forgiveness. One such tale speaks of Brother Theodoric, a monk in a German abbey during the 12th century. Haunted by doubt and longing for a life outside, he left the cloister in secret, drawn by the pleasures he had once renounced. For years he wandered, living richly, then poorly, then desperately. When he returned, older and sick, the abbot received him with tears. The community welcomed him back, not because he had been perfect, but because he was willing to try again. Redemption, after all, was the beating heart of monastic life. Even saints were not immune to struggle. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux once confessed to being overwhelmed by pride. Saint Benedict himself faced temptation in the wilderness, so fierce that he reportedly threw himself into a thorn bush to drive away lustful thoughts. These were not flawless men. They were simply committed to wrestling with their weakness, day after day. And it wasn't only the young who struggled. Even seasoned monks who had spent decades in prayer and service spoke of the dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual dryness, of feeling abandoned by God, of continuing the rituals while feeling nothing inside. These nights could last for days, for years, for lifetimes, but the monastery taught patience. Faith, they believed, was not always a fire. Sometimes it was just a flicker, a single quiet breath in the dark, and even that was enough to go on. Monks leaned on each other in these times. Though silence was valued, friendship was not forbidden. Many formed deep spiritual bonds with their brothers. They walked together in the cloister, shared chores in the garden, sang in harmony, prayed side by side. In these small acts, they found strength to continue. But there were also darker times, when jealousy or rivalry crept in, when a monk refused correction or poisoned the peace of the community. In rare cases, monks were permanently expelled, cast out not in hatred but sorrow. The cloister was sacred space and its harmony had to be protected. Sometimes expulsion became a kind of salvation. Monks who left would go on to found new communities. Others became hermits, living alone in forests or caves, praying in complete isolation. And some, though fewer eyes, joined the world entirely, carrying the memory of the monastery with them wherever they went. Yet, for those who remained, every trial, every temptation was a step along a longer road. They knew they would fail. Often, they knew their vows would be tested, but still they returned each day to the chapel. Still they knelt, still they whispered their prayers, and in that quiet persistence was something powerful. It is easy to imagine monastic life as peaceful, static, untouched by time. But within those stone walls were real human beings battling desire, enduring hardship, seeking peace, not because they were better than others, but because they believed that the struggle itself was sacred. Their victories were not loud, their losses were not dramatic, but in their silence they were teaching something older than any doctrine: that discipline is not the enemy of freedom, but its foundation, that redemption is always possible, and that even in the darkest night of the soul there can be light. The monk's life was not perfect, but it was sincere. Every scar, every failure, every act of discipline etched into the long memory of the monastery. And long after they were gone, the echoes remain in the soft sweep of robes across stone floors, in the quiet hush of candlelit prayers, and in the stories passed down, not of saints untouched by struggle, but of men who faced it and stayed. Death in the monastery was not a stranger. It walked the same stone halls. It listened to the same chants. It watched from the corners of cold cloisters and waited patiently, without fear or menacingly certainty. Unlike the world beyond the walls, where death often came uninvited and unspoken, monks prepared for it daily. It was woven into their prayers, etched into their rituals, and accepted as the final act of devotion. Each morning, as the bell tolled before dawn, monks recited prayers that reminded them of their mortality. "Remember, O man, that thou art dust." These were not words of dread, but of perspective. Life, they believed, was fleeting, a brief moment in the shadow of eternity, and every breath was a gift not to be wasted. From the moment they entered the monastery, monks were training for death, not in a grim or morbid way, but in a manner that gave life its full weight. Their days were simple, disciplined, and intentional. Each act of labor, each whispered psalm, was a thread in the tapestry of their soul. And when the end finally came, it was met with silence, prayer, and ritual. a dying monk was never left alone. His brothers would gather, singing the litany of the dying, a series of chants asking for mercy, for peace, and for the presence of saints to guide the departing soul. Psalms were sung softly, the air thick with incense. A wooden crucifix was pressed into the monk's hands. Sometimes a candle was placed nearby, symbolizing the light that would guide him into the next world. There was no rush, no noise, just presence, just stillness. And when his breath ceased, a bell would toll, slowly, solemnly. The entire monastery would pause, honoring the life that had just passed and the soul that had, they believed, crossed into eternity. The body was washed, clothed in the simple habit worn in life, and placed on a wooden board or stretcher. No fine garments, no grand procession, just humility right until the end. Monastic burial grounds were often simple, surrounded by herbs and trees. The graves were unmarked or marked only with wooden crosses. There were no lavish tombs, no golden inscriptions. For the monk, the ego was to be buried long before the body. But while the physical remains returned to the earth, the memory lingered. In many monasteries, the names of the departed were read aloud annually. Some monasteries kept long, detailed necrologies books, filled with the names and dates of death of every brother who had passed through their gates. These names were whispered during Mass, remembered in prayer. Their absence never went unnoticed. And yet, for all the simplicity in death, some monks were believed to carry a special holiness, a light that shone even after life had left their bodies. These men were venerated as saints. Their bones became relics. Their clothing, books, and even pieces of their coffins were preserved, treasured, and sometimes displayed. Relics were not kept out of superstition, but out of deep reverence. They were reminders of a life lived in devotion, of the spiritual power believed to remain in the physical remnants. A finger bone, a lock of hair, a scrap of parchment covered in the monk's own handwriting, all became windows into the divine. Pilgrims traveled for days, sometimes weeks, to kneel before these relics. They touched them in prayer, lit candles beside them, believed in their healing power. And in this way, the memory of the monk lived on, not just in the monastery, but across villages, across kingdoms, across centuries. The concept of the afterlife for the monk was not vague, it was vivid. Heaven was imagined as a place of perfect peace, where the soul would dwell eternally in the presence of God. No pain, no hunger, no noise, just endless light, love, and song. A kind of divine monastery, but one without walls or weariness. Purgatory, too, was real in their minds, a place of purification for souls not yet ready for heaven. Monks prayed daily for these souls. It was one of their sacred duties. They believed their prayers could ease the suffering of others, could shorten the time spent in purification, could help a soul rise. And so, even after death, their work continued. In the middle of the night, while the world slept, monks would gather in the chapel by candlelight to chant for the dead. Long, mournful melodies that echoed through stone arches, their voices low, steady, lifting names into the dark. Prayers rising like smoke. They believed in the communion of saints, that those who had died in grace were not gone, but present in a different way, that the monastery was filled with more than just the living, that their departed brothers walked beside them in spirit, prayed with them, watched over them. Some monks had visions of these soul streams, of bright figures in white robes, standing near the altar or sitting quietly at the edge of the cloister garden. these were not seen as hallucinations, but as signs, comforting messages that their brother had found peace. But not all deaths were peaceful. There are stories whispered through time of monks who died in despair, who doubted at the last moment, who broke their vows or fell into sin. Their deaths haunted the monastery for years. Their names were sometimes omitted from prayers. But even then, the monks believed there was hope. Redemption could stretch beyond the grave. Masses were still said, candles still lit. The monastery never gave up on a soul. And in this, perhaps, lies the most beautiful legacy of monastic life, not the silence, or the chanting, or the austere rituals, but the deep, unshakable belief in grace. The belief that no life was wasted, that every tear, every failure, every whispered prayer had meaning, that death was not an ending, but a return. In time, some monasteries crumbled. Their walls were overtaken by vines, their chants silenced by war or reform. But the legacy endured. In the manuscripts they copied, in the relics they preserved, in the whispered prayers that echoed through time. Today, when you walk the ruins of an old abbey, you can still feel it, that hush, that stillness, that sense that something sacred once happened herein, maybe still does. Because death, for the monk, was never the final silence. It was just the bell that rang one last time before a greater light began. Across the wind-swept hills of Europe, beyond the stone paths and quiet chapels, still standing, lie the forgotten, ruined arches, crumbling cloisters, moss-covered walls where birds now nest and ivy winds like memory through broken beams. These are the remains of monasteries, once alive with prayer, discipline, and devotion. But time, like tide, has pulled them from the map and from the mind. Not all monks belonged to the great orders we remember: Benedictines, Cistercians, Franciscans. Beneath the surface of history lie countless smaller communities. Some flourished for a time, others flickered like candles before vanishing into shadow. There were the Carthusians, who embraced deeper silence, stillage, monk living alone in a cell, coming together only for prayer, speaking rarely. Their lives were so austere, even other monastics found them extreme, and yet their order endures, hidden in valleys and behind high stone walls. There were the Benedictines, a double order of monks and nuns, founded by a Swedish mystic whose visions shaped their rhythm of life. They built elaborate abbeys of red brick and chanted 7 times a day. Most of their houses were swept away in the Reformation, but echoes remain. And then there were the heretical sects communities that strayed from orthodoxy, who mixed ancient Christian rituals with strange new beliefs. The fraticelli, who rejected the wealth of the church. The Beguines laywomen, who lived in devotion but outside the strict vows of nuns. Many were persecuted, their records burned, their names branded dangerous. Sometimes a monastery simply failed. Poor soil, harsh winters, a war too close, a dwindling population of novices. Some were built on fault lines, political or spiritual. Others fell to the ambitions of kings, who eyed the wealth behind their thick walls. And some were deliberately destroyed. In England, during the 16th century, the dissolution of the monasteries brought brutal change. Henry VIII, breaking from the Catholic Church, ordered the closure of over 800 monasteries. Monks were turned out, altars smashed, sacred books scattered, gold melted down, roofs torn away to discourage return. What remains today are skeletons of grandeur, empty windows framing sky, stone stairways that lead nowhere, carved angels worn faceless by rain. Yet there is beauty here, quiet, aching beauty. Ruins like Revo Abbey, nestled in the Yorkshire Dales, where mist curls between pillars that once held a roof above 600 monks. Or Melrose Abbey, its rose-colored stone glowing at sunset, where Robert the Bruce's heart is buried beneath the floor. In France, Italy, Ireland, Germany, across all of Europe, monastic ruins whisper. They hum in the wind. Their silence is different now. Not discipline, but memory. Some are barely noticed, swallowed by forest, or used as pasture walls. Others have become pilgrimage sites in their own right, not for relics, but for the feeling they evoke, a longing for stillness, for reverence, for something lost. We walk among these places as visitors, but the stones remember, and the diversity of monasticism, even in its forgotten corners, was astonishing. Some orders allowed music, elaborate robes, art. Others forbade all beauty. Some fasted constantly. Others brewed beer and cheese to sustain themselves and their guests. Each community was a world unto itself, shaped by the personality of its founder, the needs of its time, the geography of its place. But none were immune to change. Monasteries could become too powerful, too wealthy. The simple cell became a palace. The humble vow became a loophole. Reformers rose from within, like Bernard of Clairvaux, who urged a return to purity. Others came from outside, wielding fire and sword. And yet, even in suppression, something remained. A chant learned by heart, passed from voice to voice. A book hidden in a farmhouse, its script still legible. A carved stone, dug up centuries later, revealing a coat of arms no one remembers. The monastic impulse to withdraw, to focus, to devotees not gone. In today's world, there are those who still seek that life. In the Alps, in the deserts, even in cities. New orders rise. Old ones endure quietly, but the ruins speak too. They are not just casualties of history. They are reminders. Reminders that silence matters, that time moves on, that even the most disciplined life can vanish, but never entirely, because something always lingers. A wall, half standing in the mist. A field once tended by hands, now dust. A bird singing where once bells rang. And within us, a strange yearning for what was lost, for what might yet be found. Perhaps the greatest lesson of these lost monasteries is this: nothing sacred ever truly disappears. It changes shape, it hides, it waits. And when we walk through the ruins, quiet and slow, we are not just seeing stone, we are remembering what it means to listen, to wonder, to believe that somewhere in the silence the chant continues. And now, as the echoes of the monastery grow quiet and the candlelight fades into the stillness of night, ... Thank you for joining us on this journey through sacred stone, silent vows, and centuries of devotion. If you found peace in these stories, or felt that quiet curiosity stir within you, please consider subscribing. It helps this channel bring more forgotten histories to light, one soft breath at a time. Leave a comment below and tell us which part of monastic life intrigued you most, or maybe which ruin would you one day like to visit. And finally, wherever you are in the world, ... may your evening be calm, your dreams full of wonder, and your soul gently at rest. Until next time, sleep well.